I could start by introducing myself a little bit. As Jeremy said, I'm Ben Wilson. I've been an environment artist. I've been in the industry now for about coming on 11 years, I think. And I've been an environment artist for the vast majority of that, about 8 years or so. And then I moved over to material art. And and then just this last year, in January, in fact, I moved over to a tech art position. So I think today, what I'd like to go through is talk about kind of like how I sort of think about materials in a production. We'll go through some of the sort of common mistakes that I see in designer, how how you can sort of work with metrics, and we'll talk about the blend modes and the math behind that. And specifically, we'll take a look at this material. We're not really going to do a step-by-step step through of it, because I think that's going to take too much time. But I'll use this graph as a kind of discussion point to sort of illustrate all the points that we go through. Okay, so I also want to apologize. I've got a cold right now, so if I suddenly mute myself or you hear me cough, then I apologize. But okay, so right at the start, when we're thinking about designer, the first thing I would like to talk about is the histogram view, because if you're not familiar with it, or you're not really using it right now, then this is the number one thing that I think you should change. So you can get to the histo view by clicking this button here in the 2D view, and it basically gives you a representation of it's a count of how many pixels have a given value. So you have your sort of 0 to 1 range along here, and then this vertical bar is describing how many pixels at that value are present in the image. And of course, with a linear gradient, every value is equally likely. So, we have a nice even distribution. If you look at something like a Clouds 2, you can see now the distribution is mostly centered around the sort of bright image. And that's sort of reinforcing what you see, right? The intuition here is pretty clear. This is generally a bright image, so the histogram is mostly in the higher numbers. And what you can see here, what this specifically is telling us, is that these values, the darkest value in this image is, I don't know what that is, like 0.25 or 0.2 or something around that. So there's no blacks in this image at all. And likewise, there's no ones. If we continue on, here's more intuition for this. This image is very dark, so here we've got lots of blacks and very few whites, and no pure whites at all. And then this one's interesting because this is actually really difficult to read. But what you're seeing here is that there is a lot of blacks and a lot of whites and almost nothing in between. Okay, so that's the histogram view, and this is really going to inform everything you do in Designer. So the first thing I think you should do is get yourself set up with a working material. And this is just it's just a regular sort of like base material. You can expose these. Not this one. You can expose like these inputs or whatever, and then you can set them out on set them up to be outputs. And what this does is it lets you just right click, drag and drop onto the viewport, and then you'll see your materials sort of working in progress. What I've done for mine is I've set up this tessellation height scale value here. So on the node, you can set what your metrics for your texture, so what the height depth is and the surface size, and then it's going to output the number that you need to input for your tessellation height scale here. So this is really useful, and like we're going to talk a lot about these metrics going forwards. But this is something I would recommend looking into. I actually go through the math of this in one of my talks, so we won't bother going through it here. But yeah, I find this really useful. You could just type in your numbers, and then it tells you what your height scale would be. And then what that actually is doing then is it's setting up the viewport to be in centimeters. So what you're seeing visually is real world scale. And that's super useful because now it means that you can start eyeballing what you're seeing in the viewport and feel confident that the values that you're working with are correct. So it eliminates all the guesswork. Get yourself one of these; they're really cool. Okay, so if you've worked with Designer at all, I think you'll probably come across this sort of concept of having a horizontal sort of a sort of mainline chain through the graph, and you sort of as you work you start blending things into them. Like this would be your height channel, and yeah, you have the sort of main line, right? Um, so this, I think, is a really good way of working, and I think you can also extend that idea and have this concept of features. So what you're seeing here is a height and a base color channel, and along the vertical, everything in these vertical columns here are related. So this would be the height information for a feature. This would be the base color for a feature, and a feature is it's just an abstract idea, right? It's just basically it's some network of nodes that are designed to be a sort of modular self-contained unit. In this case, the feature is just this noise, but it could be anything, right? It could be a really big graph, it could be a really small graph, or a network of nodes. But what makes it a feature is that it's a self-contained modular thing that you want to blend into your height or into your material. Yeah, and then in terms of organization, you have the nice horizontal sort of horizontal bars telling you your progression through the material, and then along the vertical bars, you have all of the content that's related to that feature. I'm also waving my hands around like you can see it. So just imagining I'm conducting a musical or something. Okay, so for the height, uh, the ideal setup that you really want to be working with, and this kind of is the start of thinking about working to metrics and working in a production. The ideal setup that you want to be building your height to is this idea of you have a 0 to 1 range for your height, but zero point 0.5 is corresponding to no displacement. And then anything above the 0.5 is a positive displacement, and anything below is like a negative, pushing it below the ground. So this 0.5 is your ground level. And the reason for that is it makes blending a lot easier, which we'll see going forward. But it's also how Painter expects your height to be set up. So if you make anything and you want to bring it into Painter, it's gonna actually take this 0 to 1 range and remap it to -1 to 1, meaning that right in the center is going to become 0 and no displacement. So there's really no reason not to be set up with this sort of mid level being your ground. And if we have a look at this setup here, I've got this node here. It's representing my ground, so it's a value of 0.5. And then let's say I'm going to add some stones into my texture. I can just set them, I could just add them. And then because I know that I'm going to be doing positive displacement, I just need to make sure that I'm only using half of that 0 to 1 range, right? Because now what we're gonna do is add 0 to 0.5 on top of our ground level on no displacement. And likewise, we can maybe add a puddle or something. And in this case, I'm using subtract. So now we're actually subtracting from the ground. Okay. So before we dive into like the specifics of metrics and like looking at all these graphs and talking about blend modes and such, I wanted to cover some sort of common mistakes that I see that are very easy to make in Designer, and I see a lot of people do. And I'm hoping that it's going to provide some motivation as to why it's important that we are working in metrics. Um, and so what I mean by working in metrics is this, where we've set up our ground plane being 0.5, and then we're making sure that we add positive displacement and subtract negative displacement. And then what makes it a metric is you set up, you assume that this range, this 0 to 1 range here, is a given depth in centimeters. So if this is no displacement, that obviously corresponds to 0 centimeters. But then as we approach 1, maybe that goes up to, say, something like 10 centimeters in space. And likewise, we could subtract 10 centimeters. Those numbers, conceptualizing those numbers and just picking those numbers is putting you into a metric. So that's what I mean by working through metrics. So the number one thing I see all the time is that you just don't consider the values that you're working with. So here we have the exact same setup as before, but this time the ground, it now has a bit of detail in it, right? So now this isn't exactly flat. It's got it goes below the ground a couple of centimeters. It goes above the ground a couple of centimeters. And now the issue is that when we add our stones, they get capped out, right? And that's because we've added at the peak, we've added 0.5 on top of a value which is, I don't know what, like 0.6 or something. So it goes above 1 and it clamps out. And likewise, when we subtract, because there's now more range in the ground, we've clamped out. So this happens all the time, and it is just a symptom of not really considering your values, not really understanding, like what the numbers are doing and what they're corresponding to. The solution here is we just make sure we don't add so much, right? Likewise, you just make sure you don't subtract so much. Okay. So this is also another very common mistake I see. So here we have the same setup as before. We've got some ground, some stones, got some sort of noise, surface detail on them, whatever. We're subtracting our puddle, but this time, I've taken the stones and I want to add some, I don't know, some other type of surface detail in them. So I've just taken the class 2 and I've just blended it on top. But you'll notice here now, because these stones here, they were in the 0 to 1 range, but after I've blended them, they're no longer in 0 to 1. You can see we've got no blacks, we've got some dead space here, a little bit of dead space up there, and this is an issue because when we then adjust our values, you'll notice that this bottom number here is actually shifting. I'm not sure how well this is coming through on the stream. It's a little sluggish on my computer. But the reason why this is an issue is because now you can't guarantee, or you don't understand what your values are actually doing. Whereas before you knew that 0 was 0 and 1 was 1. Whereas after you finish blending, you no longer do. So it means that everything after this point is very much guesswork. Okay. I think this here is probably the most difficult kind of mistake to catch, and it's probably the one that affects you the most. And you can think about it as a like a hidden dependency. So what we have here is our ground again, blending in the stones. This time the ground has a bit more information in it. So I've taken my stones here, and I've reduced the intensity and blended them in with lighten, and I've basically just used the viewport to see what I've decided that this looks good, and this is what I want to go with. But then I decide, you know what, I actually want this ground's too noisy, so I'm going to reduce the intensity here of this clouds too. But the problem now is all of the stones have shifted. They've actually reduced in number. So if I was happy with the number of stones that were present in this texture, after I've reduced the intensity of the ground, I then have to go back here and I have to, adjust this slider to sort of get back to where I was. And then what we actually have here is now we have two sort of independent locations in the graph that we have to tweak in conjunction or together to make a sort of a single change, right? Our conceptual change was just to reduce the intensity of the ground, but this node here, this feature, has a hidden dependency on the values of this ground, and this is really frustrating because it's very difficult to spot as you're working, and really makes your whole graph it's just more difficult to work with, and it's harder to iterate on because you can't really get an idea of how your values are or how your sort of features are. You can't trust them to be modular. So this is the number one thing that you really want to look to avoid. Another example of why it's really important to be working to a given metric. Let's say that these are two materials. We have some dirt here, and then we have another kind of dirt. But this time, the texture just so happens to be that all the values are down here in the dark ranges, and in our other material, all the values are in the light ranges. And of course, if you try to blend them together, these values don't make sense together. They're built to different metrics. And this if you have tessellation in your game, or even if you derive normal information or AO information from your height, if you do any kind of blending and the materials aren't sort of considered in the same metric, then you're going to run into this issue. So I think I brought this up because this is something I've seen a couple of times as a sort of a fix for incorrect metrics. Is that you might think that, okay, what if I just normalize both of them? So now I just add an order level, so they're both in the 0 to 1 range. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that, because the two materials are still designed in different metrics. So although the ranges are normalized, now our flat kind of dirt is like crazy spiked, and even our kind of noisy dirt has become over exaggerated. So even though they're both now normalized in the 0 to 1 range, they're still conceptually built to different metrics. So I hope after going through this, it's a little clearer, like why it's important that your graphs are built to metrics and your materials are built to metrics, because you run into all of these kinds of problems. So for things we can do to sort of fix that, for removing these hidden dependencies and making your features truly modular, like I kind of worked on this uniform additive blend node. Again, all of that was covered in one of the GDC talks, so we're only briefly cover it here. But the concept of it is now that if I want to take this feature and remove it, I can just bypass the node, and nothing else about the material changes. And likewise, I can just remove this feature and nothing else changes. And then if I were to, let's say, change the ground, like make it maybe flat or lift it up, like everything stays as it should. Nothing about the material changes. They all just, now correspond to the new height. So this is the sort of setup that I suggest that you should try and aim for, where you have these features that are truly independent. They can just become plug and play. So we won't go into the detail of this node, but I do want to briefly talk about like what's happening underneath. So let's say we take our ground and our feature. So what we want to do is, just blend it on add. Here, there we go. So we've just added the feature onto the ground. So the add mode's important because that removes that weird hidden dependency, right? So now whatever this node does, this feature will correctly correspond to those changes because we're just adding the values on top. And then this is now obviously, because this is in 0 to 1, this is completely capped out. So then we need to bring this feature into the metrics, and that's where you can use like the intensity slider on your ad or something like that. Now, of course, the problem now is we have all of the detail from the ground coming in. So what we should do is just blur that. So now we're adding the stones onto a blurred version of the height map. And what the blur version is doing is giving you the average of the height, right? So if this intensity was super high, say something like 64, you can see like it's averaging the values. So we can now add our stones onto where the height is minus all of those details. But of course, now if we actually have a look at this, my design is a little slow because of the streaming, I think. Yeah, if we look at this now, obviously our background's blurred, so we would just blend this back on lighten, and we'll talk about the blend modes in a moment. That kind of fixes it, right? Because now we're getting some of the ground, but what we actually want to do is we want to make sure we blend on lighten only where this feature is. So we can just take a threshold in order to generate a mask from our feature and blend it back in. So that's what this node is doing. There's a little bit more in there to give you some extra sliders and stuff to play with, but the concept idea is that we add our feature onto an averaged version of the height map and then just blend with lighten the mask. That's the idea of it. Another very useful way to sort of solve these hidden dependencies throughout your graph and making sure everything is two metrics is using this auto levels histogram range combo. So if I bypass this auto levels for now, so this is the same setup before. Like we're generating some dirt, just blending two materials here, and you can see what the histogram looks like. So then, if I say change my mind and I want to, I don't know, let's say we want more of the the fractal sum base in here instead, you can see that all of the values are shifting, right? But what's problematic here is that not only are the values shifting, the actual endpoints are shifting. So if you had in your mind and you had sort of, further down the chain, you had blended things together uh, to what the values that you see here, and then you decide to change them, then everything breaks because all of these values have also shifted. So what the order levels and histogram range is doing is the order levels is normalizing everything to 0 to 1, and then you're using the range as a way to bring yourself back into the metrics. So if we were to say that this is plus minus 10 centimeters or whatever, and we want this ground to be plus and minus 5 centimeters, then this would be 5.5. If we wanted it 2 centimeters, then this could be 0.2 or something like that. But you'll see that because these were normalized and then we're squishing the range after the fact, these positions will never change. So if we go back and we start adjusting our values, you can see the values inside are shifting, but the endpoints remain the same. So we can always guarantee that we have this much space to add stones or subtract puddles or whatever, So yeah, moving on to the blend nodes, because outside of these sort of these tricks and ways of blending things, really the best way of working to metrics and making sure your graph is sort of reliable is just understanding the blend nodes. So yeah, add is as simple as it is. It's add. We just add the two inputs together. So if we have a gradient, this makes sense here. We've already capped out halfway through. And if you think about it, if you look at any given pixel, or if we look at the very center pixel, that's going to add 0.5 from this input and 0.5 to this input. So the value is already 1 when we're at the center. And then everything up here is going to be above 1. And actually, what I've done here is I've set it to a floating point number, and that lets us actually see the values. So if you click on the information here, you can hover over, and you can start reading the actual values that's in the image. So you can see we're now going from 0, we're already up to 1, and then we get reach 2 when we get to the top pixel. Subtract obviously is the opposite. What's cool about subtract that you might not be aware of is if you take a value of 1 and you subtract something from it, also in the 0 to 1 range, that's actually the same thing as invert. The intuition for that's pretty simple, because if we look at this top pixel, we take the value of 1 and then we subtract this image a value of 1, and then of course that's going to output black. So yeah, it's a nice way of how inverts work. What we have here is a multiply, so we're just multiplying the two gradients together, and then I've just taken a cross section so that we can kind of visualize what's happening. Now multiply is obviously really good, but one of the properties of it is it produces this non-linear curve. So you can see that as we reach the lower numbers, the amount that we subtract is relatively smaller than the amount that we subtract when we're in the high numbers. So it makes multiply is very difficult then to kind of gain the intuition for how much you're adding or subtracting, because that value shifts depending on where you are or what the specific values are. Screen is exactly the same as a multiply, but it's actually inverted. So here you can see that the relative offset when you're in the high numbers is much smaller than when you're in the low numbers. And here you can actually, I just included this here so we could see actually what that setup is. So, here's our A input, it's just the gradient. Here's our B input, this is just the gradient. But you can see I've inverted them first, and then I've inverted the result, and that gives us a screen, exactly the same as a multiply. Okay, so moving on then to add sub. So I think add sub is probably the most useful blend mode, particularly when you're working with height. But it's quite awkward to use, which is why I think many people avoid it. But add sub is both addition and subtraction. So it's going to take whatever is into your background slot, and it's actually just going to add whatever is into your foreground slot. But these values here, this 0 to 1 range, gets remapped into -1, 1 before it gets added, meaning that anything that's below 0.5 will become subtraction. And that's a little awkward to use because it means that, let's say we wanted to make sure that we don't produce, we don't cap out our values, then this would have to be like 0.5, and then this would have to be like 0.25, and then you can sort of guarantee that you're going to remain in the 0 to 1 range. But it's pretty awkward having to think about your values like this. Luckily in practice you don't really have to, because typically you would just have the opacity a lot smaller, right? You would just have to be aware that add sub is both adding and subtracting. And then I've included here the same setup but manually, so that we can actually look at the values. So if we have our 0 to 1 gradient here, we can actually look at the values, and you can see that this is getting remapped to 0 to 2, and then we subtract 1. So now it's going from -1 to 1, and then that's just added on top. So that's actually what happens with add sub underneath. Moving on to overlay then. So overlay is both multiply and screen, but it chooses it based on if it's above or below a value of 0.5. So if our input is above 0.5, it's going to use screen. If it's below, it's going to use multiply instead. But otherwise, it's just the regular multiply and screen modes. What's let's see, oh yeah, okay, sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. Yeah, so you can see here then one of the issues with the overlay blend mode is because it is this just binary, am I above 0.5 or am I not above 0.5, you can end up with this harsh transition. So that's what the soft light blend mode is designed to fix. So soft light is exactly an overlay. It's going to be either a multiply or a subtract or a screen, sorry, depending on where it is, what values are going into it. But rather than just be an on or off, it's actually an interpolation between them. The implementation, there's lots of different implementation for soft light, so I don't know which one design is using, but the design intent for them is to do a overlay, but blend between the two algorithms rather than just an on or off. So you can see that it is the same. It's just a smooth transition now. Then let's look at what one's this? This is lighten. So lighten, it just outputs whichever is the brightest pixel. So if our gradient drops below the value of 0.5, it's just going to output 0.5, and darken is the opposite. Just take the darkest pixel. So these two blend modes are really important for blending height information as well, because if you have something like your dirt with stones, it doesn't really make sense to use any other blend mode than lighten, because if you were to look at a given pixel, uh, your stone material, it isn't really kind of like 50% mud or 50% stone. It like any other blend mode doesn't really make sense. It's a stone material, so it should be stone. So you would use lighten because it would just output one of the two inputs, right? It's not going to be a mix of them both. Um, Obviously, you like in the case of uh, the setup that we did for the blending mode, you can see now, because we're blending stones, we're using the max lighten, but in this one we're using the add, and that's to make sure that the node remains independent. So that's kind of like handling the hidden dependency, and this is blending in the material. Okay, so that's kind of like the theory out of the way. So I now wanted to show how that is put into practice on an actual graph. And I think that this graph is a good one to look at because it's very close to what I would consider a sort of production material, um, in the sense that there's scan data here that is designed to sort of work procedurally. I've been thinking about the metrics as I've been building it. Um, a bit of a disclaimer on that, which I'll get to. Um, and I try to sort of remove all the hidden dependencies where I can. So just right off the get go, I think you can kind of see the horizontal structure. You can immediately read this is related to height, this is related to color information, and then here's the sort of features. And then I can immediately be sure that anything that I see here is going to be related to each other. And what I think is really nice about this horizontal and feature kind of concept is I can I can look at what the input is for my height map. So I can just look at this, and then I can look at what the feature coming in is. Um, and I immediately know that, oh, okay, so this is stones. Like I don't really need to care about how it was built, because I can just look at the end node and know, okay, this is what the feature is. So if I'm opening up someone else's graph and they've been set up like this, it makes it very easy to read and understand their thought process. And likewise, we could just step down. It's like, oh, okay, these are more stones. It becomes very easy to see what's going on. And here's more stones, etc. Maybe have something different. Okay, here's some scan data. But yeah, you can immediately see, okay, now I'm blending in scan data. Okay, so let's see how these sort of metrics and this hidden dependency stuff works. So just looking here, I can see that, okay, I've made some kind of base dirt, and then I've brought the thing into metrics. And that's what this histogram range is doing. So if I sort of step back through this, you'll start noticing that, okay, I've got kind of two main features, or sort of two elements to this feature, right? And both of them are actually normalized in the 0 to 1 range. And that's really important for that reason we discussed before, is that if I start reducing or playing with these values, I need to guarantee where the endpoints are. So for this range to work, these need to be normalized in 0 to 1. which means that this blend here, it's kind of like a ratio, right? We're basically describing how much of these two features we want to use, more or less. Let's see. So if we start stepping back further, you can see here we have this vector warp, and then what I've got here is this auto levels. And then these values here coming in for the warp angle, they're also normalized. And this I think is also really important because I want to make sure that this feature, this whole thing, is in the 0 to 1 range, right? And if, for example, I decide that I don't like how much noise this is, so I reduce the roughness and maybe start like reducing, make this a much softer noise. And you can see just how much these values have shifted. So it makes it very difficult to work from, right? So this auto levels is normalizing for the same reason of I'm making this vector warp independent of anything else that happens in the graph. And likewise, the input for the warp angle is also normalized so that this value here, this intensity value, if I decide to change, here you can see that normalized. If I decide to change this one, so it's super low, this vector warp's intensity value still remains like relative to what it was, right? It still remains consistent because the vector warp angle coming in is still 0 to 1 range. So this sort of setup of normalizing your values to make your graph independent from each other is really really important, and this I think is really key for what makes something a kind of production material, because you're going to get feedback and you're going to get iteration. Um, you're going to have to iterate on your work, and if your kind of graph is set up such that it's difficult to do that, you're not going to want to do it, and you're going to start making bad art. So you need to sort of set yourself up so that working in your graph is much easier and reliable and robust. And this sort of this normalization, you're going to see it a lot. So if we just sort of start stepping through, here's another a warp with normalized inputs so that we can guarantee this slider behaves. Here it is again, normalizing so that this slider remains consistent. And it just goes on and on. Here it is again. And then we normalize. Okay, so now that our sort of feature, these are in 0 to 1 range. I now need to sort of bring it into metrics, right? Because this is in some arbitrary range. But I know that my material should be, I forget what values I actually used for this. So 30 centimeters of depth, right? So I know that this 0 to 1 range is corresponding to plus or minus 15 centimeters. And that the surface size, so from this end to this end, is 4 meters. Then I know that I should reduce my histogram range such that these values now make sense to what you see. And this is what's really important and really powerful about working to metrics, is because once if you know what your actual size of your material is, it means you can calculate the tessellation height scale, which then means you can set the viewport in centimeters, which then means you don't have to know this value. You can just eyeball it in the viewport and know it's correct. This node here was that huge disclaimer I said. Here I've just darkened the values to give myself more room. This wouldn't be in a production material, so you just have to pretend that this doesn't exist. I did this because I was being lazy, so you wouldn't have this in a proper game. But the rest is very valid. I've got some So let's actually step through this a little bit, right? So this was the sort of base ground that I started with. Then I decided to just add some scan data on top. So what I've done is, I brought some scan data in. I think this came from textures.com. I don't really remember. I've made some tweaks to it to make it kind of to remove some of the noise. This again, you can kind of see why the specifics of the work you did kind of doesn't matter. Because what I'm doing in the end is, I'm normalizing it so that my feature is in the 0 to 1 range, and then I'm blending it in to the metrics. So this intensity slider is set such that it makes sense in the real world scale. And I do this a lot, and this I think is a good point to talk about. Using the scan data. Here it's not very procedural, but this is going to be like base dirt, right? I'm going to blend stuff on top of this, and trying to make this stuff look this good in Designer is a lot of work. When all you can just do is grab a bitmap, and it's fine, because you're barely going to see it, and it adds so much more like realism to the material. So in real kind of production materials, this is the kind of thing you see a lot, where you have a kind of procedural base, and then you just start layering in scan data. Then let's see, what do I add next? So now I start adding in some extra small stones. And now I think it's very clear, what I'm adding, because this feature is independent and it's in the 0 to 1 range. So I can read this image very clearly, and I know that I'm just adding in stones. I don't even need to look at this because I don't really care how it's put together. Then I add some further stones. Let's see, this is so this is the first place that I actually sort of start proceduralizing the scan data, but this is not the clearest example, so we'll move on to this one instead. Yeah, so this is where I add sort of larger stones. And we can look at these. So what I mean by proceduralizing scan data, what I have here is a stone layer, procedural stone layer that I just made in Designer, right? So this has like X amount, Y amount, blah, blah, blah. I can change these stones. I can iterate on them. That's fine. Then I do some stuff just to make this node work. This node here is then adding the surface detail. And then this surface detail is scan data. So I've just taken some rocks. Again, I think this came from Megascans or textures.com. And that's what I'm using to sort of blend and offset and add onto my procedural stones. Again, the implementation details of this isn't really important, but you could just see that it's a series of warps and all the regular stuff. It kind of doesn't matter. What is making it procedural scan data is that we're doing all of the surface, all of the heavy lifting. This kind of stuff is really difficult to do in Designer, whereas scattering stones is really easy. So we're using the best of both worlds. We've got the flexibility of the stone layers, and then all of the detailing is coming from scanned information. And actually, this setup back here is the same thing. I've just got some procedural stones. In this case, it's just cells. And then I've taken some scan data and I'm blending it on top in some way. So all of the heavy lifting is coming from scan data. So another thing I think is really important with sort of production materials, and this goes back to making the graph easy for you to work with. In this case, I ended up needing to have, in fact, maybe I can show it a little bit further on. Yeah, so I needed to generate this ambient occlusion here, what I was doing was getting myself a mask around the large stones. But the problem is if I just took an ambient occlusion from like my main height so far, you can see I've got all of this extra noise and stuff in, right? So what I needed was the height so far, but minus that detail. So you'll notice then at some point I've had to sort of double up on these blending nodes, right? But the problem now is that I've got two locations. So if I decide that I want to add more stones or something like that, I'm going to have to adjust it in two locations, which is a real pain in the ass. So this is where you can use like the input values, and then you can just plug them into both. So now if I need to make any edits to this, I just have one location to tweak my parameters that do both of the nodes. I just saw a real quick question about what are the yellow frames. That's just a UI thing saying that this particular node isn't supported in an older version of Designer. If you go to preferences, I think it's in. Oh my god, it's so slow. Yeah, in projects, it's this guy. So you can say which version of Substance do you want to like compare against. So now, because I put it to latest, these aren't yellow anymore. No, it's just a UI thing. It doesn't mean anything. So yeah, and then this setup is just then repeated. I've added some stones. I've set up some parameters for myself so I don't have to adjust these two nodes together. And one thing that I think is important to mention about this as well is that this because of the way that we've blended them using that method before, these are plug and play, right? So if I just remove this thing completely, the stones just disappear and nothing else is affected. There's none of these hidden dependencies, whatever. And that's really it for the height. It's just this stuff repeated, and just going through adding more stone layers, blah blah blah. Okay. So now moving on to sort of the color information. The thing I wanted to point out here is it's really important to always base your color on your height in some way. So what I've got here is a big list of just noises to generate color from. But you'll notice that all of them have this warp angle input, or if not the warp angle, in some degree they are coming from the height. So I've basically taken my base height, and then that is informing all of my color gradients in some way. So I can be sure anything that I colorize going forward is going to have some connection to the height. Let's see. So then, I've talked about color a lot, so I'm really going to gloss over this. But there's one specific area that I'd like to talk about. So what I was seeing in the reference, so it was all of these colors here. We had like this red, this orange, and this sort of brighter gray. And I was noticing that they were all connected in some way. Like the gray was always visible underneath the red and the orange, whereas the red and the orange seemed to be independent. So they were whatever, but the gray was always underneath. So what I've got here, you can see. So I've got my three colors: the gray, the red, and the orange, and then they have their masks coming in. So if we look at the mask, so this is the mask for, I think, what is this? This is the red. So yeah, I just generated some masks. That looks cool. Then I've got the one for the orange, but then you'll notice for the gray, I'm generating the gray mask by the two masks from the red and the orange. And I wanted to bring attention to this because this is a case where I've intentionally added a dependency on the graph by design. So it's not that everything in your graph has to be completely modular and separate. In this case, we actually wanted them to be related in some way. So yeah, and then what I've done is now I don't want to be adjusting these three parameters simultaneously if I want to sort of just remove the amount of color. So I've tied them all to one value. So if we look at the color here, now I can just edit this number. Oh, I've actually hooked it up. Let me now I don't remember which one it was. I think it was accent color, maybe. Yeah. Now I've just got one slider which controls everything, right? Which also brings me onto a sort of slight tangent topic, which I wasn't going to talk about. But this slider is set up such that 0 correlates to no information at all, and 1 correlates to like fully textured. And I like to set up the sliders like this because it feels a little bit more intuitive to me that, yeah, if I have a value of 1, it means that the whole thing is going to be that feature. Let's see. That's largely it for color. I mean, if we could. Oh, this bit's worth talking about. This is another scenario where I'm generating some noise based off the height information, but this time it's coming off the facing normal rather than just like a warp or something. But what I've done here is I've made a dedicated normal node coming off from like the feature itself. So it doesn't come from the height because I might decide that I want to, change the intensity, in which case changing the intensity would change the color. So instead, I take normal from the feature itself so that the color can remain independent from whatever settings I choose for the height. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up about the color information and then therefore the roughness is where do I do roughness? Yeah. So I have a node here to generate roughness, which is actually all it does is a grayscale conversion from the base color, and then it blends some value underneath. So I think I would have like a uniform color here with just some value, and then like this is blended. I think it's on overlay. I don't really remember. The point being that I've just taken the base color and just derived all of my roughness from the base color. And this works because in this case, the material is so rough to begin with that you don't need a lot of information in the roughness. What's important is that it isn't a solid color, right? You can see just how bright the values are and just how little information you have. So like what's the production material part of this is that you're being lazy, and in some cases you can just do the old school Photoshop, just grab your base color and create some roughness from it. If this was if this was like a metal texture or something where the roughness is a little bit more important, then maybe this process would be reversed, where you would have a whole section of network dedicated to roughness, and then maybe you build the base color off the roughness, or the base color is like more or less a solid color. It really depends. But yeah, if you don't need to spend time on something, just don't. And that's yeah, I think that's basically everything I wanted to cover. I guess we've run over time a little bit. How are
A
we
little
for
bit.
time?
You're all good though. You warned me weeks ago that it was going to be over.
Sweet. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, shall we jump to some questions?
Yeah, there's a few in here. There's some good ones.
I hope
Let's
this
see
makes
here.
sense to everyone. I'm going through it quite fast.
Dude, I mean, here I'll just keep the card up here for everyone to see who who's
I
talking.
haven't really been keeping up with chat, so
Oh, it's all good. I've been watching chat just to make sure we didn't miss anything.
sweet.
Um, but yeah, and you're sick, so we got to make sure we get through these, and then you can just go lay down, unless you have to take care of your kid.
No, he's asleep.
Oh
He's
man.
asleep. Luckily.
Okay, so what are the? I mean, I guess you answered this question. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see junior material artists make? You kind of answered that through your.
Yeah, yeah. So there is actually one thing that I wanted to bring up with this because this kind of relates to art tests. So it's an absolute must that you're thinking in metrics, that your materials are in metrics. Um, so the metrics that you pick is going to depend on kind of the project, the specific of the project. But if you're working on, I don't know, like a first person shooter where you can get right up to the textures, then you're going to use, I don't know, some value. And then if you're working on something that you never get really close to the texture, maybe like a fixed camera or something, then the values you use there are going to be a lot different. And what the specific values could be, really, uh, it depends, but you can make some educated guesses, right? I think if you start getting up to the 30 centimeter mark, like if your height map is supposed to be representing 30 centimeters, if you start going higher than that, you really start reaching into territory where you sort of want mesh support. So um, I think even if you're not sure, you can make some educated guesses as to what an appropriate number should be. And it's typically somewhere around like 10 to 30 centimeters, something like that. Um, but yeah, by far the biggest thing uh, I see junior material artists not doing is they basically use designer visually and they don't really think about the numbers. Um, they just kind of cobble their way through blend modes, just blending stuff together and not really thinking about the metrics of a material, and it's really important.
Dang. Okay. Metrics.
Oh, actually, one thing I wanted to show before we jump off that topic. Um, this was my graph before I tidied it up. Uh, I think you can. So this was me like just working through, and I think you can kind of see there are these vertical features, right? But it is kind of all over the place. Um, and I think working like this is fine. I think it's important that you you just work with the flow. You don't really think about making sure everything's neat and tidy. Just do your thing. But then afterwards, when you go to sort of submit your material into Perforce or you're submitting your art test, it needs to look like this because other people have to read your graph.
Dude. So you do bleed. uh, let's see. If you want to get a job as a material artist, what should you focus on in your portfolio or when you're creating your
Hmm.
portfolio?
uh, so I think it's really important you start making scenes, or if not scenes, like maybe I don't know props or even characters, whatever. What's important is that you're building a set of materials to context um, that are designed to blend together. So just having kind of one-off materials, it's I mean it's really good for showing how good you are at executing um, like on a particular material, but it doesn't really tell you how good you are in a production where you have to make sure your metrics are correct, make sure that the tiling is good and stuff like this. And uh, that kind of intuition really only comes from experience. So I think you need to be making scenes. Um, the good news is you're not an environment artist or a character artist for that matter. So you don't have to be making big stuff. You can literally take a corridor and create a few materials for it. Um, yeah, the important bit is that there is something there that is forcing you to work to metrics and forcing you to blend your textures together and think about it. Uh, I think
Nice.
then I would say maybe the storytelling in the textures. Yeah, it's fine. I think having uh I don't know, like if you're working on cobblestone or something, I would want to see that, there's bits of foliage debris in there. There's bits of like leaves and twigs and stuff that people have kicked up with their shoes, and that you're thinking about this, um, and that kind of storytelling I think is really important.
It's like material interaction in a logic
Mm.
from a logical sense.
Yep.
How should you set up renders for materials? Map ball or preferably an environment? It sounds like you were saying environment.
Yeah, so I think actually this is a great question because the topic of like Daniel Tiger always comes up here, and he is a fantastic material artist, but his ArtStation portfolio is not what a material artist portfolio should look like if you're looking for work. And I think it's very important to understand that, um, a portfolio like Daniel's it's basically a place for him to express his art. Yeah, Daniel isn't looking for work. I mean, I'm not sure what he's doing now, but he was a lead at Bungie and stuff. Like he doesn't really use his ArtStation as a way to showcase the services that he can, um, give to studios. So if you're looking for work, I really feel that your ArtStation should have um, these kind of production materials. They should be a set of materials which are very related to a scene, um, and in that the way that you then present them is that if you can present them with the scene, um, always present kind of like breakdown shots, so like the texture flats, so that it's then sort of easy for if I was reviewing the portfolio, it'd be easy for me to see the individual channels, and make sure that they're valid and that they look good and stuff like this. um, and then if you've done anything interesting with the graph, like say you've got some exposed parameters, I'd want to be able to see them. I think actually if I can get up the post for this material in particular, um, this is probably a good example because I didn't make this for a scene, so I don't have a context shot, which is really bad, but you should do. However, here, let me pull it across. Uh, yeah, so I've got like a GIF here to show how the height progressed, and then I've this is one for the color, and then this is showcasing um, how even though it's largely scanned material, it's fully proceduralized with the color because it's all based off color pickers. And then here is the graph being randomized to sort of show that, yeah, it's scanned data, but it is fully procedural. So yeah, if you have anything kind of to do with sliders or any special setup with the graph, make sure you show that in some way. Um, and then for the map ball, I personally really like the ball renders for the thumbnail image. Um, and that's just because when you're looking at you're looking at sort of, oh my god, it's so slow. I'm looking at all of this. I can immediately see if it's a material because it's such a common format to have materials. So I personally really like that because I know what I'm looking at just from the thumbnail. Um,
Yeah, I think I told you
oh,
to do that more with your materials
congratulations!
too.
Up on the front page. Uh, but yeah, then once you kind of you're in the project, the sphere render. it's helpful for showing kind of how the lighting interacts with the material and such. But the real important one is the context shot. Um, and then yeah, I'm a big fan of the top down renders as well because I like that you can kind of bask in the in the details. You know, like so for most of my renders. Well, my internet is really not happy about.
About you streaming.
Yeah, so for my renders, I like having the whole kind of view set, and that's because what I want or what I hope to happen when people look at this is they kind of just like enjoy the details as they scroll down. So I really like top-down shots personally.
It kind of looks like you had a scan tool. You were taking a photo, but it wasn't a full flash, so the edge is like darker.
Yeah, I think there's a vignette on it. Yeah, a slight vignette.
So are you using the for your presentation in materials? Are you using like a PBR render node in Designer, or are you using Marmoset Toolbag?
I use Marmoset Toolbag mostly, and I guess it's largely because I'm just comfortable with it, and it's really good. The renderer is really good. It can make almost anything look gorgeous. So uh,
So
yeah,
so it's
so
your
I mean,
Instagram tool.
why not use it? But I use I use the PBR node quite a lot actually. So all of these kind of GIFs were made with the PBR node. So actually, that's what this graph here is. So after I finished my material, I then started generating the images for the ArtStation post. And I think what I've done is, yeah, I've just taken like all of my various things that I want to show in the GIF, and then this is how I'm um, making these GIFs. And then here's the PBR render node. So this is for the height. I've just taken the different stages of the height, and then I would just let the render node do its thing and just copy the image and paste it into Photoshop to make the
Oh, that
GIF.
looks nice.
Um, yeah,
So
so
that
I use both. This node is really good for showing sliders and stuff. Um, but the stuff that you can get out of this node is really good. So if you can't, because I think you have to buy Marmoset, it's
yeah,
pretty expensive as well. So like if you don't want to buy it, just use this PBR render node. It's really decent.
it does the trick.
Yeah.
So Attila in Discord has a ton of questions for you. I'm only gonna grab one or two of them.
Hmm.
But the questions that are in questions for DinCon are visible to you if you want to answer those outside of the stream.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, just so you know, because there's some deeper ones there. But one of them says, "How do you manage your color palette for your materials in a single scene? Make them
Mm.
consistent or harmonious in the scene?"
So I actually think the key to that is limiting yourself. So for this material, uh, let's see. So I've got a main color, two main colors, and then an accent color. There's actually three accent colors, and that's largely because this specific material, what made it interesting to make was that there was these big color variation in it. But typically, you would limit yourself to sort of three or four color pickers. Um, maybe like a stone accent or something like that. But the idea being is that you've limited yourself. So once you sort of finished your materials and you've got them all into the scene, you then only have a handful of sort of parameters to adjust to make sure everything then comes together. I think that's probably the easiest way of unifying everything like a whole set. Um, and actually staying on that point, what I think is really important is I wouldn't worry about nailing color at all until you've finished your environment, basically. Um, Sorry, my partner just came in. um, and that's because you can spend the time like making your material look good in Designer or Marmoset, but then as soon as you bring them all into the environment, they're all just going to look terrible anyway. So like do a good first pass, make it look good in Designer, but don't stress about it. Uh, but then after you've kind of got everything in the scene, that's when you really start. Um, I call the term like going through integration hell. It's like you got to integrate everything together and make sure that it fits.
Yes.
Uh, that's when you really start tweaking. And yeah, and if you can limit yourself to how many sliders you have to play with, that really helps.
Let's see here. Okay, so this question is how much does material focus affect environment design and vice versa? I guess it's like is material or
Mm.
material artists chasing the environments or the other way around, or is it kind of like a push and
Uh,
pull?
in my experiences, it's largely being the environment's driving everything, and there's almost no consideration for materials. Um,
Is that a bad thing?
uh, Not really. There's some considerations that have to be made, like like the project metrics. So if your terrain has tessellation, you need to decide pretty early on, like how much displacement should the materials have, like how much displacement should there be on the terrain. Um, and then obviously that decision informs a lot about how you build your materials. But the specific materials you build are still largely coming from the reference from the environment, right? So, yeah, in my experience, outside of those kind of technical considerations, uh, it's usually just the reference for the environment that's driving what materials should get made.
Right. So everyone's kind of heading in the same direction anyways.
Mm, yeah,
Um, how often do you update your designer version? I imagine you're quite up to date with all of your plugins.
yeah. As Actually, almost every update, because usually the designer updates are pretty good. They usually introduce some really cool stuff. If you're early on in production, then updating isn't so much of a pain. But as you start getting closer to release, uh, you have to be careful about updating software because it can break. Because designer isn't backwards compatible, for example. So if you have, I don't know, particularly with codev and you have multiple studios, uh, they might be working on multiple projects as well, and yeah, having lots of different versions becomes really problematic. So yeah, the closer you get to the end of a production, the more tight that becomes. But yeah,
Nice.
designer in general is really good with updates, so I try to do it as often as I can. I think
Uh,
this one's latest.
yeah.
What is one, two? I think that's latest.
Nice. So we only have two more questions.
Hmm.
Uh, and then we can let you rest. so you kind of answered this one before, but I think it's worth iterating on. But right now, Ezekiel in Discord is working on a material in which he's combining megascans with some other details that he's created, and he feels like he's cheating by not doing it 100% substance. It saves him a
Oh
lot
no,
of time, but yeah,
yeah,
is cutting corners. If it is it cutting corners or being smart?
it's definitely being smart. I think there is there's some stuff that you should do to help yourself, which is you know largely how this graph is set up. Where I've got um, some procedural layer or some procedural thing which has the scanned layer on top. If you can get to this point, that really helps because then you can leverage the power of both. Um, but particularly in like proper production, like you're usually on such a tight time schedule that whatever gets you the results the quickest, within reason, and I say within reason because you obviously want to make sure you're flexible enough to iterate. So um, yeah, just using all scans is in my opinion not good, because then you can't iterate easily. Uh, but yeah, like, don't bother making stone surface, because you'll never reach the quality of real life, and just dragging in a bitmap is so much easier.
It's I mean, this whole idea of cheating in game art is kind of prevalent in every field, right? It's like,
Yeah,
am I
it's
cheating
real.
if I use alphas in Designer or in Substance or ZBrush, and I'm not sculpting it myself? Or what if I'm bringing props in from mega scans, and
Mm.
like, is that cheating? But
I think
yeah,
I think it's like, particularly on the sculpting. I think it's really good to be doing this sort of stuff in personal art, because yeah, it's useful. It's useful practice, and it's useful, like, understanding those workflows, and you know just practicing your art skills. So even if you don't, even if you're at work and you don't make your stones in Designer, and you just drag them in, or like your leaf textures or whatever. Um, I think it's useful to practice that stuff, because it can only make you a better artist. Uh, but I do want to kind of append to that uh, if you're looking for work, the things that you need to show are the things that are directly relevant for production. So uh, these kind of big, crazy substance materials, they're really awesome to show kind of, you know, a bit of personality to you and how good you are with Designer. But if I need someone who can make procedural dirt materials, then that's what I need to see in the portfolio, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers the
yeah, I
question.
think that answers it. The last question actually was answered, I think, in the channel itself. It was basically, what are some tips for building great albedo maps? And they always run into trouble building towards a complex albedo map. And it was
Mm.
actually was what was linked was your talk for the candy
Yeah,
shop days. Do you want to
I
expand on
spent
that video at all?
yeah, so I spent a long time thinking about this problem of color in Designer. Um, so yeah, the way that I like to work is to more or less, let's see, it's a good example. Uh, yeah, so more or less have, a color picker, and then some kind of grayscale map to inform how much, like, to vary the hue and the saturation and the luminance and stuff like that. That's kind of like the full process that I go through. um, and I think that working like this just makes everything so much easier, because you really limit yourself. uh, and I think as artists, it's so much easier to comprehend what your color is if you just have a color picker. So yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I spent a long time making this node, but I would just use. I don't color any way else now. I only use these nodes.
Nice. All right, dude. I think we are done. That was quite long, and I appreciate. I mean, I think we all appreciate you coming in and talking
Yeah.
about this.
Well, thanks for hanging around. I apologize for taking so much time.
It is all good, man. Um, but yeah, I think if you want to say anything, Ben, before you jump out, I'll say a few words to you after the stream.
Yeah. I think it's consistently all of these talks have run over. So I think next year you're gonna have to make them 2 hours.
Oh my god.